Vivo Legal Tech for Africa.
Good evening, Af- good evening, Africa and beyond. Welcome to another impactful episode of Vivo Legal Tech for Africa, where technology meets law and the continent's digital future takes center stage. Tonight, we step into a critical conversation, one that touches every device we use, every byte of data we generate, and every freedom we must protect. As AI accelerates across borders, powering decisions in our homes, hospitals, courts, and government, a new frontier emerge. Who guards our data? Whose rules govern privacy when machines know more about us than we know about ourselves? And is Africa ready to shape its own data destiny? To navigate this terrain, we are joined by none other than Keagile Lesolle, a leading lawyer and expert in data protection, whose voice is shaping policy and practice across the continent. Keagile, welcome to Vivo Legal Tech for Africa.
Thank you for having me on, Ba. It's a pleasure as always. I'm a big fan of your work. I'm a big fan of your channel. I've been watching your episodes leading up to this point, and you have some really high production stuff. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to share my wealth of experience, and I'm hoping that we can be able to educate the people as to what we have going on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. In this episode tonight, we'll explore how AI challenges traditional privacy regimes, the current state of data protection laws in Africa, and why must Africa develop sovereign, right-based approaches to data governance, and what role you, as a digital citizen, a lawyer, a policymaker, or a tech innovator, must play in safeguarding our collective future. So grab your seats, power your thought, and prepare to challenge assumption. This is Legal Tech for Africa. This is where the conversation begins. So let's start by setting the stage, Keagile. Can you briefly introduce your work in data protection and what drew you to this area of the law?
The thing about data protection is it's new. We all can take away from the fact that it's a new kind of concept being explored in Africa in any way, and how the interdivide between typical African legislation or views around data as a general concept have been leading up to this point. So as an emerging concept, especially as how the global trends are going, it was one of those things that I felt as if, if Africa is going to be able to compete with the general diaspora, we all as practitioners in the private sector need to be able to understand how or what it even means, right? So for a lot of us, it was a question of what does data protection even mean? What is data, and what are we seeking to protect? Is it yeah?
That takes me to my next question directly. To your mind, I mean, in your estimation, what does the concept of privacy or data protection mean to you, especially in the African AI age? Would you say African government and institutions are prepared for the data implication of AI?
Let me start with your last point there, and I think it's the easiest one to answer. I think no. I think Africa as a whole is starkly far from being able to properly understand what the concept of data protection is. Um, but what I think is data is such a big question, and whenever I am asked this by clients, colleagues, and so many different other spaces, I usually say data is you. You know, data is who you are. Data is the concepts that make up Ba, that makes up Lesolle. It's what it makes up any particular person. And when you dumb it down like that, I think it makes it easier for people to get the gravitas of what is data. Because
Mm-hmm.
in a more detailed way, data is the information that makes up particulars about yourself that help identify who you are, help identify how to be able to trace things back to yourself, inclusive of your IP and well, includes IP in the sense of your where to be able to find you on the internet and the like. But it's a nebulous concept about your specific information about your gender, your sex, information about the kind of things that you enjoy watching, enjoy seeing on the internet space, and the kind of things that relating to your trading profile, how much money you'd like to take out, how much your loans are, et cetera, et cetera. So that it's really about being able to identify yourself. Is Africa in a position to really protect that? No. And I think it's because we don't understand the ends of it as a
Mm-hmm.
continent, or even let me bring it down to my jurisdiction. When we're talking about data protection or data as a whole, for a lot of our clients,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them think about it in the more technical sense, right? They tend to gravitate towards, a tech nerd such as yourself or myself, to say, oh, data is the ones and zeros that make up the computer. They don't think about it in the sense of, the average things that go into it. So um, we kind of have a difficulty being able to associate it with ourselves in today's age in Africa, or at the very least in the Botswana context.
I mean, exactly. To that point, which of the African countries you've mentioned, Botswana, do you think are currently leading in the data protection space, and where can others learn from them?
So I've seen a lot of general successes coming from, I think, two states.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One is in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
The PAPIA is generally their act really regulating data protection, the PAPIA Act, or the PAPIA, um, generally has, I think, a little bit better protection, or a little bit more protections to the GDPR, if we're contrasting them. And this was in my, as we're studying data protection and what's up, because we don't necessarily have a real course, we contrasted with the POPIA and with our act, the DPA, the Data Protection Act.
To someone
So,
watching, sorry, to someone watching, you mentioned the
yeah,
GDPR. What is it for someone watching us now that may not understand what you've just, spoken about?
yeah.
What
So
is the GDPR? Yes.
the GDPR is your European equivalent of the document protecting people's rights in relation to their data. So think of it as the bundle of protections available to you to be able to ensure that your general protections as to how your data is managed and used throughout the world. The
Mm-hmm.
greatest thing that comes with the GDPR is that it provides protection not just here, or not just in the European context, but in the context. It adds protection as long as you are a European citizen, wherever you may be. So those protections then apply even here. So if I'm holding your data, remember we're looking at in the big sense. So if you have an account here, you have a bank account here, they are required to ensure that they comply with the GDPR with your information. And so a lot of countries use it as the benchmark to understand how best they then provide protections to their people, because they don't want to be caught out and say, well, I provide XYZ protections that are below the GDPR, but I'm required to do more or do as much as the GDPR. So it's really that bundled protection that people use, or that most jurisdictions use as the baseline for the protection of people's data. That's how we can
Perfect.
be able to generate something.
Yeah. So at the moment, as it stands, do we have an equivalent to as Africa or countries in Africa? Do we have an equivalent of the GDPR? Because you've mentioned a huge protection, because you even said even if it's extra jurisdictional, extraterritorial, even if the citizen is not within the European Union, it still protects as long as it's an EU citizen. Do we have an equivalent of that in Africa?
We do, in a sense. We must understand that with the GDPR, there would be protection across all European states, right?
Yeah.
Which is because of its protections available as governing law, in a sense. But for the African context, we do, but not in the same kind of levels of protection, because it's more international law as opposed to what falls as national or implementable national law for a lot of different states. Because remember, in Africa, we tend to have a difference of viewpoint as to how international law then implicates international law. So there is it. I'm going to have to bring it up ever so slightly
You
to
want
quote
to
it specifically.
yeah, you want to send it to me so I can share it with viewers? Is it something you want the
Yes,
viewers to see? Yeah, you can.
No. It's
Okay.
just the actual name of the African version of the GDPR.
Or the Malabo Convention, you mean?
The Malabo Convention. Yes,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
forgot the name of the actual convention that it was
It's
at.
okay. Yeah.
Yes, but it applies in the same kind of sense. The intent is the same, right? To provide a continental protection available for data protection and the like. But most jurisdictions, such as in Botswana, have their own national version, which usually falls more in line with the GDPR than with the Malabo Convention. Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
So
talking about national laws, which several African countries like Nigeria, like Kenya, like South Africa, and yours in Botswana do have. One thing that has come from report is that their efficiency is weak, their enforcement is weak, and that's why I ask if we actually do have an equivalent to the GDPR, because I know how efficient and strong the GDPR is, to the point that it has attracted the attention of digital colonialism. I mean, the European Union
yes.
taking that stride. So how, in your assessment, would you think these laws in our own case are effective to the point that it protects citizens from their data being exploited?
Okay. The best way I can be able to give you a kind of use case or a real case evaluation of that is in the Botswana context. So
Perfect.
the Botswana law has enacted the Data Protection Act, the Botswana Data Protection Act, the DPA, which was passed as legislation in 2018. But from 2018, there was no commission. So we didn't have a commissioner who was available to be able to ensure that data protection was actually enforced. It was only later in about 2022 that the commissioner herself was appointed, Ma Somolokai. Now, from 2018 to 2022, that meant what? There wasn't really any protections that were going on. It was an act
In paper.
enforced, but it was not implemented.
I see.
And from 2022, we only then caused the act to be enforced in 2024. Right? So between 2022 and 2024, the act wasn't necessarily enforced. It was an act of parliament, but it couldn't be enforced. Reason being, the government found it fit to understand that Botswana as a whole was not in a position to actually find itself to say, well, are we actually protecting people's information? Are we protecting people's data?
Mm-hmm.
And so we took about 2 years for the private sector, for the public sector to catch up to what the legislation required of us generally. But I promise you now, even to date, we don't really have that in place. Most institutions do have engaged their internal data protection officer to ensure compliance, but our act doesn't put it as a requirement. It's you are entitled to, you may employ a data protection officer. And the reason, of course, is that we're unsure whether or not we could really cause to action all of our private sector entities to make sure that data protection is protected. Because if you're looking at that timeline, therefore, since 2018, we only have about just shy of maybe 8 years, if my math is correct, or maybe 6 years or 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
whereby we've actually considered it as something of contention. So there's very few of us in market, or very few of us in practice, who actually know the act like the back of our hands, who know what its implications are, who know what the GDPR is, who know what the Malabo Convention is, and what all of these things go into how your protections are supposed to be afforded. So Botswana, I think, is your typical African country in the sense we want to catch up. We're making efforts to catch up, but I think we're a long way from being able to ensure that, um, bah, if whatever account that you may have, whatever information that you may have here is protected, right, at
Perfect.
any given point in time. And I think even on that case, there's only been the commissioner, to my understanding, they're having a really strong uphill battle with enforcement. They only have recently started to engage industries to find out whether or not they are compliant recently. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking about 2 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's as far as what they've been able to then begin their investigative processes to figure out whether or not there are sufficient safeguards available. But we're talking about since 2018 to date. We've only really started the investigative process maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So there's a lot of ways to go, but I can implore them to say that they're actually making steps. There's a lot of our brothers and sisters in different jurisdictions that are yet to even appoint a commissioner, let alone um, take investigative steps.
Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes it appears to be so sad, because like you said in the beginning, the importance of protecting your data. Some people have, even though my lecturer will not like it, but some people have used the oil metaphor to say data is the new oil now. It's actually a very precious resources, and one that must be guarded and protected. Now these existing frameworks that you've mentioned, are they adequate enough, especially in the age of AI, or do we need new models in your estimation?
I think the problem with AI is that it's ever evolving. Every day, the tools get much better.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, in our context, we are estimating protections that were available essentially since 2018,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because our law has not necessarily changed for the better. I think because we are struggling with being able to access the best kinds of technologies, it makes it very difficult for our lawmakers, or at very least the commissioner, to really try to implement the right kinds of, or determine how best to implement the right kinds of protections. I think there is definitely a need, especially in our context, to try and have a level of overlap, to say, as we're making these protections, we need to build in AI so that as technology is getting better,
Mm-hmm.
our protections itself are able to keep up with that.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's definitely a need, and it's definitely something that we need to be able to get into. But it's more of a question of how do we realistically, in the African context, then bridge those divides between where we are technologically and where the rest of the world is, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, this brings us to the question of who is responsible to do some of these things you've said. I mean, there is a role for the government, like you said, and and also I think private tech companies, and
Yes.
and in fact, the most important people in the loop are the data subjects themselves, the citizens themselves. So, in your mind, who do you think has more responsibility, to ensure we get where you envisage us getting with the others and the rest of the world?
I'm going to take a pretty controversial take, and I'm hoping your viewers don't don't crucify me for it. But I think the information, or a lot of it, in my view, has to do with us as data subjects. The ultimate responsibility, in my view, lies with the data subject, especially if we're considering the African context. We as Africans know, and I can't imagine us not knowing this at this point, that our leadership, our governments, and those in power do not necessarily at all points in time have our best interests at heart.
Yes.
We cannot sit here and say that our governments are altruistic in this real sense. A lot of them are self-serving, and I won't mention countries, I won't name names, but it's important, therefore, to say, well, how do I protect myself in the market, in the space that is looking to make profit off of my information, right? I think therefore becomes a question of literacy, or at the very least information literacy, or literacy in the data protection space for the average data subject. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be able to understand what that means, because remember, because of the fluidity of data and information in the global sense, my information here carried out here may not necessarily be used here or be abused here. It may be abused in Western worlds and in Eastern spaces. So it's important for us to be able to understand what realistic rights that we may have on the individual scale. Yes, government should play a role. Yes, private industry should play a role. Yes, market leaders should be able to figure out how best to be able to protect their clientele. But to me, it always will boil down to you and I. I'm not too sure if there's been recent information that I've read about, some blog posts that I've read about how YouTube is now trying to have a verification in the US
Yes.
for
And
your child content.
I mean,
Yes.
here in the UK, the Online Safety
Mm.
Act just came into effect a couple of days ago.
Yes.
And now,
Yes.
before you
Yes.
before you access anything, let's say on X, former Twitter, before you kind of get access to certain content, you are asked to verify your age. You have to
Your
take a
age,
picture of your
yes.
face. You have to submit an
Exactly.
ID. I mean, all of these things are going on here. And
Yes.
but one thing that intrigues me, one thing you mentioned, you said our government, our leaders do not always have the best interest for us. I would go further. It's not about controversy. I think this is the right thing we're saying here. I'll go further that they've never had our interest in the first place. And now, being that they've never had our interest, we are in a space that is so volatile. We are in a space that is so I wish I can have an adjective to describe this space. People don't even know the space that we are in. I mean, we don't know. We just take these devices, open them up with our faces, our pictures, all our. But again, the thing about Africa, we're not too private. We are not private people, but it is so. Our worry is, especially in our context, is about mass surveillance and voter manipulation. That's why I want us to take this conversation. Sorry.
Yes.
At that point, what can you say? About how we protect ourselves against these systems being used for mass surveillance or voter manipulation in our democracies.
It's a very difficult one because I think any way that if we're having the candid conversation, I think it's very difficult to envision an Africa whereby the front running mind or the front of my political leaders' mind is not how we then manipulate our voters. How do we not arrest them to ensure that the information that we carry or the information that we carry is used for the political gain or for the political benefit? I do not see us having legislation that necessarily protects us against that. What I think and what I think realistically we have to be able to contend with as African states is being able to say, okay, how do we ensure that as we engage in these different platforms, um, we are cognizant of the kind of information that we're putting up and how that information generally can be used for nefarious purposes as we understand it. Um, a lot of the kind of platforms that we're engaging in are hardly ever um, government or African born institutions. So it becomes a question of how do we then ensure that, well, as these Western or Eastern or wherever it may be based apps are then what do they then use that information for? Do they sell them to our leaders? Do our leaders then purchase them to be able to understand how local trends are moving in terms of engagements and the like? It's a very difficult concept, but I don't think that I have a real like concrete solution as to how far we could be able to provide a safeguard, because I understand personally what goes into our leaders' mindsets as a continent generally. Not to point out anyone if my leaders are listening,
Um,
not to point out anyone.
Kigali, I mean, it's not only about platforms from the West or from the East in China or in India. Also, what about platforms being developed here in Africa? I mean, quite recently, my government developed a system called OneGov, where they're trying to put every government business, say, for example, applying for a new license for your car, or perhaps applying for a new passport, everything in one basket. Every information being loaded in one basket. And something came to my mind. Being a data protection aware, I was like, what if all this information this government is accumulating is for election manipulation, which is possible? I mean, if the government no, because one thing we don't have in Africa is we don't have our government. I don't know. I mean, we're getting there, but they don't have the full raw data of their people. They don't even know how much of their people are like what they're doing. They don't have those those information. But I'm saying here is, what if they're using this information for something, or for an ulterior motive, for something else? I mean, and then there is no law. Like in Sierra Leone, we don't have a data protection law like you guys in Botswana. And where is the yeah?
I think the plausible next step is something that I don't necessarily think is workable in a lot of states. And my plausible next step is something akin to a ombudsman of sorts, government watchdogs, independent authorities that are able to ensure that whatever government does or whatever institutions do, they're using that information for proper purposes, not for anything else. But that subsumes that those institutions could come to the light of day anyway. Take, for example, in the Botswana context, we do have an ombudsman. We do have a government watchdog facility.
We do have it as well, but it's appointed by the government. Ours is also.
So we're in the same page. We're in the same boat. So it in as much as we can say, well, it's there. It could be able to ensure these safeguards. We know what could be because of the fact that these are government appointed officers and the like. So it's really a faux pas of things, rather than being the truth of the situation. If we're in a perfect world, that would be my solution, to say, if we have an independent media that's able to criticize the state, criticize the government, bring out all of these misappropriations of information funds and the like, it creates this cohesive environment whereby the checks and balances themselves aren't necessarily built within the government, but it's within society as a whole, then protects us, generally speaking. But because we lack that in the African context for one reason or the other, it becomes difficult for me to agree that these protections could, in the foreseeable future, be be realistically implemented. I think it's a real problem that we have, and that I don't think is solvable. So has a solvable means within you or my lifetime, right? I think it's going to take our kids or our kids' kids to even get to a point whereby, yeah, we're there. I know my information. Even if I were to give my information, I know it could be kept safe. But that's not. But even still, that's not per se a unique problem in our context. Still, even in Western civilization, there are questions. These are real questions to be had about how information is kept and stored and used. Think about the government grillings of Meta and associated other associated tech houses, and how the U.S. was very, very critical of how they use, store, and sell information, generally speaking.
Great. I mean, let's try back. Let's try to take the conversation back to the topic. We kind of drifting a bit. Now we talk about AI systems, and AI systems are cladded with bias and discrimination. So how do we avoid bias and discrimination embedded in these AI systems developed, especially in Western context, but used in Africa?
The best case scenario is for us to develop our own tools, our own AI tools. Take, for example, we've struggled. The biggest buzzword here that we have in private practice for law anyway, in Botswana, is AI and the use of AI in private practice. We've had, I think there's one judgment that came from the highest court of our land, the Court of Appeal, whereby the Court of Appeal was lambasting a couple of attorneys for seemingly using AI-generated cases, which they couldn't find at all. And it was talk of the town for a good month or so. And so what I was saying to a lot of my colleagues is that, we are heading kind of towards a reality whereby legal practice needs to be dominated by AI. Needs to be, right? Because an AI removes somewhat of the element of failure, right? In a perfectly structured AI model, right? If our AI systems were accustomed to our jurisdictions, our systems, our people, and how our societies work, then it's definitely possible for those AI tools to be able to give more accurate and more, system-specific answers, right? If those AI tools were built around the Botswana system, right, the Botswana legal system, I promise you we would have likely had a more robust argument as to what the position may be in terms of the law, rather than us focusing on some of these failings of AI, because you would then be able to use those systems to then compare and contrast, the position of one judge vis-a-vis another on the same subject matter, and see how those arguments are ultimately laid out. So for me, the best case of scenario is for us to be able to build tools around it. And I think we have enough smart people, we have enough people in tech fields to be able to build those models. I think it's just about how well we as the people then encourage them to, how we support them to be able to build those models for our general benefit.
All right, perfect. At this point, I would like us to go for a break, at least a minute's break, and come back and continue the conversation. Thank you very much for being around. To everyone watching, this is your program, Legal Tech for Africa. We're back in the next 1 minute. Stay tuned.
Wevo Legal Tech for Africa.
Welcome back, viewers. This is your program, Wevo Legal Tech for Africa, coming to you live from Facebook and YouTube. If you are just joining us today in the studio, I'm with Keagile Lesolle from the beautiful city of Gaborone, Botswana. And then we're looking at data protection and privacy in the age of AI for Africa. And whose responsibility is it to protect our data? And where are we exactly as a continent with data protection? So far, the conversation has been enlightening and insightful because we have an expert in the field. Keagile, I want us now to look at sovereignty and cross-border data flows. I mean, there are several concerns over data colonialism, as I mentioned earlier, and dependency on foreign tech platforms. Of course, at the moment, we don't have our own platforms. I'm not sure. I think there are few in South Africa and in Nigeria that are coming up with AI platforms or AI models. At the moment, we don't have any. We are relying on Gemini, ChatGPT, Copilot, Meta AI. Even to the point now we have DeepSeek from China.
Yes.
So what do you think? What are the calls for data localization and African data sovereignty?
I think the beautiful space that we're in 2025 is that it is not it's not an arms race in the real sense. It is a race of the mind, right? In much earlier days, much before you and I were born, before even our countries were born, the name of the game was control, and the name of the game was strength.
Yeah.
In today's age, the name of the game is how intelligent you're able to use the resources available to you. Take, for example, DeepSeek. It didn't take the same kind of resources available to ChatGPT to be able to build a better model, right, as an AI tool. So I think we as Africans need to be able to say, okay, how can we be able to as well enter into this space, for one? For two, how can we be able to build this bigger and better than our competitors? And how can we then take a greater space or a greater place in this arms race? I think that there are enough resources available for our comrades in Africa to be able to take the reins of control. But I think what we all need to do is be able to understand what the name of this game is. That it's not necessarily just an African. These are not necessarily just African contexts that we're making use of. Yes, it'd be perfect for them to be able to take into consideration at the African context,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to what many of other AI models are built around, which is Western or European contexts. But if we were to as well look at it in the sense of, well, it has African bases included, but we're trying to service everyone else, then I think Africa as a whole, or at the very least that particular wherever that model is based, would be able to participate and deal with the growing ends of the market share, which is in other kinds of Western or Eastern models. So I think there's more than enough ability for us to be able to participate, and I'd love to be able to see us, meaningfully participate and meaningfully challenge our competitors, but we're yet to see that come into fruition.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, we've spoken about different responsibilities of government and the data subject themselves, citizens. One thing I think we left out was that of the regional bodies, because I was hoping to talk about the AU in general, but then I realized even at the AU level, we are not having a consensus. I mean, you look at the Malabo Convention. Only 14 African countries have ratified it since its enactment. So, what do you think? What role these regional bodies like SADC should play in harmonizing all those laws for a greater good, for our protection?
I think it's. I'll have 2 points to make. I think firstly, when we consider the African context, I generally sympathize with a lot of African countries for not ratifying, and of course that's another hot take that I'll have. Reason being that we aren't necessarily, generally speaking, as a continent, in a position to ensure protection. Right? Do we have the mechanisms available to ensure that protection? And if we do, how well are we able to do that? Right? That to me is the primary concern, and I understand a lot of that. Well, that should be the reason for any kind of resistance. But the second point to that, for those who don't know, I know bar from when we were mooting together in university at the All African Moot, and the question was centered around international watchdog authorities to try and ensure that protections were available to certain persons, right? And at the time when myself and my moot partner were preparing for Take Me Back, and when we're considering how best to be able to then make our arguments around it, the consistent viewpoint that her and I had was that, well, African international entities are generally speaking toothless dogs in the real sense. There's all bark, no bite, or there's barely any bark and there's no bite even to that bark.
Ours
So
is the
there's very weak
worst.
Yes,
ECOWAS is
yes.
the worst.
I think SADC is trying its best to compete with you after what was going on in Zimbabwe. But that to me is really what the problem is. I think, yes, we can have general consensus about the idea that we should have international entities trying to enforce protection of rights. But the problem is our rights, generally speaking, fall into the same categories as any other rights. Right? Our right to protection of privacy and the like falls into the same category of any other right. The right to protection of life, liberty, all of that, which we've seen in Africa trampled left, right, and center, day in and day out, even to this day, even in this night. I'm sure you and I can be able to bring up thousands of examples that can be able to showcase that happened today, whereby a person's rights were trampled without reservation, without qualm, and our international authorities have done close to nothing to ensure that protection. So I have no personal views, or I have no personal means of being able to say, yeah, African contexts will be able to provide those, or international entities will be able to protect those rights. I have no reservation of my mind. There's no portion of my mind that thinks that will ever happen, right? Or that will happen in a lifetime that I can see. I can feasibly see it. I think it comes still back to the. I will say with my whole heart, I have no trust in those authorities. What it'll be is it'll remain for our countries and our leadership to be able to do better for our people, and for us as technocrats, for us as Protestants in our respective jurisdictions, to say we need to do better, we need more, and we need to be able to speak about that more often. So we firstly we need to be able to bolster our protections on an individual scale, right? It's for the first part of your question. And then the second part, our international entities have no means of being able to protect us. They've failed on several times throughout the years, and it's a lost it's foregone for us to even put them into the point of consideration. We should rather continue our efforts on our own local jurisdictions to push for greater protection, and hopefully we'll be able to find a greater means to an end.
Perfect. I mean, when you're you're saying those words, it's as if they're coming out of my heart. I mean, because that's the same sentiment I share, you know, and one thing people don't understand is that these are fundamental rights, and
Yes.
these are what makes society, and without them, there is no society. We're like just like the animals in the jungle. I mean, anyways, let's see if we can provide some recommendations, and let's see what reforms would prioritize, you know, to ensure we create our own ethical AI and data protection ecosystem. To your estimation, what are the potential reforms you will consider with all these problems that we've established? And before you answer that, viewers, if you have any concern, any question, or you want to contribute to the program, please drop them in the comment section on Facebook and on YouTube. We will take that to the guest. Yes. So Keagile, what reforms would you prioritize to ensure Africa creates its own ethical AI and data protection ecosystem?
I think it firstly comes from my first recommendation would be change in our education system.
Perfect.
I think it starts from there. Our people are led by education. A lot of our African states, or a lot of the populace in Africa, are either well educated, or well educated but underfunded, or B, uneducated and needing to be educated. Right. So I think it comes from the position of education. We typically, I'll speak for Botswana because that's the jurisdiction that I'm mostly aware of. I can go to almost any school, private or otherwise, and AI and generative and tools relating to tech and spaces in tech are there. They understand it. They understand that it's something that needs to be talked about, but we're still in the dark ages, speaking about things that have no relevance in modern society today. So I think in the African context, we need to be gearing or putting the right kind of framework in our children as to how the world is moving, about where we need to be focusing our energies, and what kind of thing, and what they need to be able to understand how best to be police themselves. That also goes back to our general community, right? People want to say that it's difficult to teach an old dog new tricks, but we have to teach my grandfather at the village how his information is really important in 2025. So education is one really big thing that I think should be able to take us on the right track. And the second thing is policy. Policy in terms of how it then becomes implementable in the economic sense, right? So policy needs to be put in place to ensure that our our international entities that are coming into Botswana, right? So multinational organizations and the like. Botswana needs to take a hardline stance, right? Or Africa as a whole needs to take a hardline stance against these institutions to ensure that protection is not waned here, right?
Mm.
What you find is that, especially in, well, what you find is that there's a laxed approach to how protections are available or what protections are available here, right? I'll give an example. In Botswana, we have no YouTube ad system. A lot of people in Botswana are going to get on me for speaking about that because we don't want the ads. But YouTube doesn't come with ads in Botswana because I believe that there's no system about that.
It's the same in Sierra Leone. Because we don't have businesses advertising with the platforms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there may be, in the event that, let's say, for example, in South Africa, where that is the case, where there are ads that are generated towards you, certain information is being shared by YouTube to those ad agencies. It becomes a question of whether or not that information or the information that is being shared by YouTube in South Africa is sufficiently protected to ensure that no information is being, though no unnecessary information that isn't already signed over by consent to those ad agencies. And well, when I'm there, I've never received a consent notification or a new script to say, oh, we're going to be passing over your information so that they can be able to provide you with personalized ads. Never received that, right? But I'll get 10 or 20 ads that are specifically catered towards me or just directed towards me. So I think policy needs to be the question. So we need to crack down. We need to make it more difficult for them to be able to, for these international entities to abuse our existing people or our systems and take advantage of them. So I think those are really the two things that should take in place. We need to get a hard line stance, and we need to really develop more into our education at the grassroots level, at the very base of our society.
Perfect. We have a comment from Facebook from Air Nyandemo, which I would like to relay. And she said, data protection law in the African continent, particularly Sierra Leone, is government-centered and not people's driven. If at all there is one, the fundamental purpose is likely to protect government's agenda and nothing else. And this is what we've been talking about. I have been very critical about the implementation of the Cybersecurity and Cybercrime Act of Sierra Leone in 2021, and we were behind the scene pushing for its enactment because we know how important it is to protect people online here, especially in a gullible society in Africa. But since its enactment in 2021, the act, it's like only works for the political class. I mean, there are cyberbullying, the cyber harassment coming up every day in our online space in Sierra Leone in particular. But the only cases you see that comes up to the limelight is when someone is critical of the government. Use that to say, well, there was one time someone was arrested for cyberbullying against the president of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I'm telling you, my brother. I know. I mean, it's so that's why we've been clamoring. I've been calling for a data protection law, even though I've been assured by the Minister of Information that there is one in the pipeline. But yet there is none existing, and the fact that there is none existing, the people are at risk, and people don't know this. When you have a cybersecurity law or a cybercrime law in existence, in the absence of a data protection law that should be there simultaneously to work, you are breeding a totalitarian regime, and that is not democracy. You're building a regime that will use those laws to suppress the online space. And because when there is a law criminalizing something, you must have a simultaneous law to protect the arms of that Law. I hope
Yes.
it must be balanced.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. If it's not balanced, then there is a problem. So I resonate with what my sister Air Nyademo is saying, and I feel her pain, and I share a sentiment. What do you make? I know you've spoken a lot about this before, but you have one or two words to say about this.
No, I'm 100% with her, and I'm 100% with you. You know, when we the problem that we have in the African context is that our our politicians or our higher ups in society do not turn any kind of eye to the general working class or even the general person in
The
our society
citizens,
as a whole.
yeah, yeah,
Yes, the citizens at all, any class of citizen, unless you are of the higher class, unless you are of a certain tax bracket, you're as good as dead, if we're being candid. And most often than not, in some states, even we make use of dead people to vote and the like. Um, but that's a separate issue. We need to understand that in as much as we have these gripes, and this is where I resonate very well with you, is that we know these are the problems. You and I, we can see that these are the problems. It's on us as the people,
yeah.
right, to continue to push for more, for better, right? And we must remain resolute in that. The moment that we yield to the idea that things are the way that they are in Africa and they will forever be that way is when we lose sight of the greater Africa that can be built.
Yeah.
And I'll give the example of Botswana in 2025, 2024, 2025. Before we had started, you and I had before the stream had started, you and I were talking about how Botswana has undergone a recent regime change, the first of its kind in its 60 odd years of existence. We've moved from one political party to the next, and that was a seamless move. A lot of different African countries, you know, when there is a handing over of political power, everyone waits with bated breath because there's usually a fallout. You know, there's either war, there's either turmoil, there's some level of distress. But with Botswana, we had a seamless change in power. And I think it came down to about two things. In the lead up to the election, in the lead up to the change in power, um, the citizens from all walks of life were fed up. And we all took a hardline stance to say this enough is enough with what is going on in our country, right? And we went to the polls, vivid understanding. The turnout was amazing. I think in my 3 times or so and having to vote, I've never seen that many, both youth, elderly, and the like, all of them resolute as to what they're going to do. That's one. Two, um, we and the lead up to that as well, there was a lot of small end protests about everything, anything and everything. How you know, we have a lot of sexual abuse claims or sexual abuse matters in Botswana. How we've had a lot of abusive laws or entities and corruption, all sorts of things in Botswana, and there was so much protesting going up leading up into that election and even after that election. So what I would like to be able to put as a point of encouragement to my fellow Africans, to my brothers and sisters, don't yield, right? Do not yield to power. Do not yield to the idea that we have no ability to be able to do better for ourselves. It remains within you and I to be able to call for better, right? Because that's the only way that we could ever see Sierra Leone in the ways that we know Sierra Leone can be, right? In the perfect state that it can be. That's the only way that we're ever going to see Nigeria in the place that it should be, right? As not just a titan on the African context, but globally, right? And the same goes for almost every single one of us, every single one of our countries, for all those who are listening and are paying attention. So Data protection is the tip of the iceberg in today's age of the things that we should be advocating for. We should be pressing for it, pressing earnestly with every word, every breath that we take, because we know, we all must know at this point that we deserve better. So
Perfect.
my words to you and your listeners is that you can do it, we can do it, we can always do it together. And the more that you and I hold hands and agree that this is what we deserve, the more likely that it is that we're going to be able to get that.
Perfect. I mean, I wouldn't even ask you for a final word because those words alone will resonate in our hearts true and true. Thank you so much for coming to the program, Keagile. It's been an insightful conversation. Thank you for, enlightening us with those words of yours. Viewers who have been around, thank you so much for joining us. This has been your program, Wevo Legal Tech for Africa. Today we had an expert in data protection law from Botswana, Keagile Lesolle, who has been with us, who has been enlightening us, who has been, showing us the pathway to a digital rights and a digital certainty in our online space. So until next week again, I've been your host, Mohamed Uriba, signing out. Bye-bye.
Wevo Legal Tech for Africa. Wevo Legal Tech for Africa.